They left you here to disappear, but I won't.
The rain wasn't just falling. It was slamming into Wilmington like the sky had turned against the earth itself. Lightning licked the clouds, thunder cracked low like a warning growl, and on Market Street, most people had already hunkered down for the night. But not Niall Harper. She had just finished a brutal double shift at the Pelican Crown Diner, her sneakers soaked, the hem of her neat uniform sticking to her calves with every step. Her dark curls were pulled back into a tight bun, and despite the ache in her feet, she still wore that radiant, warm smile, the one customers said made them feel welcome, even as they left her quarters and comments instead of real tips. 23 years old, barely making rent, juggling 2 jobs, and still she smiled. Still she showed up. Because that's what her mama taught her. You don't stop being kind just because the world forgot how. She was halfway home when she saw him, slumped on the bench at that abandoned bus stop near the old Rite Aid. One of those places the city forgot. No lights, no roof, just a metal bench and a trash can that hadn't been emptied in weeks. Niall slowed, blinked, wiped at the fogged-up glass of her car window. Someone was sitting there, not standing to flag down a ride, not pacing like they missed a bus, just sitting. Head bowed, rain drenching every inch of them. She almost kept driving. Almost. Because every woman raised in the South knew better than to get involved in something strange at night. And for a young black woman alone in a car in the rain, stopping could mean trouble she couldn't talk her way out of. But something about the way that man was holding his cane, clutched tight in both hands like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to this earth, stopped her. Then he looked up, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. His gaze passed right through her headlights, his face ghost pale beneath the bruises, and Niall's breath caught in her throat. He was blind. And judging by the soaked button-down shirt clinging to his skin, the expensive leather shoes ruined by puddles, and the way his jaw clenched every time the thunder rolled, this wasn't a man who meant to be there. This was someone who had been left there, alone, in the storm. She rolled down her window, heart racing. "Sir? You okay?" The man turned sharply toward her voice. "Please," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "Don't call anyone. I'm waiting." "Waiting for who?" she asked, already knowing. A beat. Then, he said he'd come back. Niall glanced down the street. No cars, no lights, no hope. Just the kind of silence that swallows people whole. "Sir," she said gently, "there are no more buses tonight. This stop, it's been closed for years." His shoulders sagged. His hands trembled. And in that moment, Niall Harper knew. This man wasn't lost. He'd been discarded. And something deep inside her refused to look away. She didn't know who he really was. She didn't know why someone had left a blind man to suffer alone in the dark. And she definitely didn't know that helping him would turn her entire world upside down. But she hit her hazard lights, stepped into the storm, and whispered the words that would change both their lives. "Come with me. I'm not leaving you here." The Pelican Crown Diner sat 3 blocks off the main drag of Wilmington's older district, all flickering neon and rusted chrome pretending it was still the 1960s. The booths were cracked at the edges, the coffee tasted like burnt second chances, and the regulars had been sitting in the same spots for years. Same orders, same opinions, same sideways looks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And steady was more than a lot of people had. Niall Harper had worked there since she was 19, ever since her mama passed and the bills started piling up faster than the grief could settle. Now 23, she'd moved through that diner like she owned it, graceful, efficient, her smile as polished as the silverware she rolled between shifts. She was stunning, though she'd never say it. Not in the way magazines defined it, but in the kind of beauty that made people stop talking mid-sentence. Golden brown skin that caught the light like honey, full lips that could curve into the warmest smile or press into a line of silent defiance. Hair in a neat bun high on her head, edges laid smooth. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were this deep hazel that seemed to catch every detail, every lie, every flicker of truth, whether you wanted her to or not. She wore her uniform like it was armor, black pants and a short-sleeved burgundy shirt with pelican crown embroidered in cheap thread over her heart.
Apron tied tight, shoes worn thin. Her figure, toned and balanced from hours on her feet, often drew attention, but not the kind she wanted, and certainly not the kind she could respond to. Smile more, sweetheart. Looks prettier on you. That from a man with gravy on his tie, not 5 minutes after she brought his overcooked eggs for the 3rd time that week. She smiled anyway, just like always. Boone, the line cook, caught her eye through the pass window and rolled his own in sympathy. Rhett Barlow, her manager, leaned against the counter pretending to review invoices on his clipboard, but Nael could feel his eyes tracking her movement like she was property. "You know," he said under his breath when she passed by with a coffee pot, "some girls would be grateful to get this much attention." Nael didn't answer. She just poured coffee for table 9, where Miss Carroll, who had once told Nael she reminded her of the help from Gone with the Wind, was flipping through a church bulletin and asking loudly if the place had any real American pie, not the store-bought mess. Nael smiled. Again. She smiled through being called girl instead of ma'am. She smiled through customers who talked to Boone instead of her to order. She smiled through the tips that never came from the same 2 men who always sat at booth 5 and laughed too loud when she bent to clear plates. She smiled when Rhett forgot to clock her break and when her hours got shaved mysteriously right after she asked about overtime. Because she knew the game. Black, pretty, young, working service. You don't push back. You don't make a scene. You don't give anyone a reason to say, she's difficult. You take the insult, tuck it somewhere deep, and keep moving. You smile. But even a forced smile has weight. And after enough days, Nael could feel it pressing into her chest like a second spine, one made entirely of exhaustion and held in words. Only Boone treated her like she mattered. Quiet Boone with the burn stars on one hand and a permanent grease stain on his apron. He slipped her extra cornbread when he could, let her vent in 2-minute bursts by the walk-in fridge, and once offered to walk her to her car after a customer followed her out the door asking if black was on the menu too.
She told him no thanks. She learned long ago that when you start depending on people, they either leave or try to own you. So Nael kept her head down, her tips counted, and her dreams small. Finish saving for nursing school, get out. Start fresh somewhere her name didn't already come with a history. But as she wiped down the counter that night, her hands aching, her back sore, she found herself thinking about the man in the rain. About the way he'd whispered, he said he'd come back. Like he still half believed it, even as the cold tried to crawl into his bones. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why anyone would leave a blind man alone at a bus stop in a storm, but she knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed. And for the first time in a long time, that feeling turned into something sharp inside her. Not bitterness, not self-pity, but fire. Because some people might have the privilege to walk away from suffering, but not Nael Harper. Not anymore. Nael didn't make a habit of inviting strangers into her world. Trust was a currency she'd learned to count carefully and spend rarely. But something about the man on that bench, the way his voice trembled beneath his composure, the bruising under his eye, the sheer wrongness of him being there alone, it overrode the rules she'd built for survival. He gave his name softly as she helped him into the passenger seat of her dusty old Nissan. Gideon. No last name. No explanation, just Gideon. She didn't push. The rain was still falling hard and rhythmically against the windshield as she turned the car back toward the diner. It wasn't ideal, bringing him there, but it was warm and it was public, and if anyone gave her trouble for doing what was right, at least there'd be witnesses. Still, as she pulled around the back and cut the engine, Nael's gut twisted. This town had a habit of turning on the wrong people. She knew that better than anyone. She cracked the passenger door open. "We'll go in the back, okay?" Fewer stairs. Gideon gave a small, grateful nod. He moved stiffly, but there was a practiced precision to his motions, like he'd learned how to navigate the world by muscle memory alone. She supported his elbow lightly, just enough for guidance, not control.
Boone was the one who saw her first, stepping out of the kitchen with a crate of frozen fries. He paused, eyebrows lifted. Then he looked at Gideon, wet, shivering, clearly not okay, and without a word, opened the door wider. Didn't ask questions, didn't raise an eyebrow. Just nodded once, then turned back inside. That's why she trusted him. Niall guided Gideon to a booth in the back corner, the one near the storage hallway. It was nearly empty, just 2 truckers nursing black coffee, and Rhett Barlow behind the counter pretending to look busy. She slipped Gideon her own apron, folding it like a towel for him to dry his face. That's when Rhett noticed them. "What the hell is this?" he barked, slapping his clipboard on the counter. "You bringing in strays now, Harper?" Niall straightened. He was stranded, blind, in the storm. He needs. I don't care if he's the Pope, Rhett snapped. You don't bring wet liabilities into my business. This ain't no shelter. One of the truckers chuckled under his breath. Isn't that sweet, he muttered. She got herself a blind date. Niall felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice steady. He's cold, Rhett. Just for a few minutes, I'll handle it. You'll handle losing your job if he drips on the floor again, Rhett hissed, stalking over. What's his name? Does he talk or just moan and collect pity? Gideon didn't flinch. He sat upright, expression neutral, but his fingers tightened on the apron in his lap. His name's Gideon, Niall said, calm but cold, and you're embarrassing yourself. Rhett leaned in close enough for her to smell the bitter coffee on his breath. You think you got leeway because you're pretty? I could replace you by tomorrow morning with someone who doesn't bring drama in the back door. Boone reappeared quietly behind him, arms folded. She did the right thing, Boone said. You know it. Rhett rounded on him. You want to pay his insurance if he slips? He's not slipping anywhere, Boone replied. He's sitting, quiet. Ain't hurt nobody. Rhett scoffed and turned back to Niall. 5 minutes, he growled. Then he's out, or you both are. He stormed back to the counter, muttering something about do-gooder theatrics and always having to be the savior. Niall let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sorry, she whispered to Gideon. Are you okay?
He nodded slowly. I've dealt with worse. But there was a tightness in his voice now, a guarded edge. Niall poured him a warm glass of water from behind the counter and brought it over with hands that still trembled slightly. You said earlier someone was supposed to come back for you? Gideon hesitated. Then, softly, they won't. His knuckles were white around the glass now. I trusted them, and they left me there. His voice cracked on the last word, not with volume, but with the kind of break that only comes when pain hits bone deep. Niall sat across from him, no longer caring who watched. She didn't know what he'd been through, but she knew abandonment. She knew betrayal. And she knew what it looked like when someone was trying not to fall apart in public. She didn't ask for more. She just sat there, steady, present. And when Rhett shouted, "Time's up," she calmly said, "He's not leaving." Because Niall Harbour had swallowed enough humiliation to know when enough was enough. And this time, she wasn't backing down. The booth in the back corner felt like a fortress, small, dimly lit, and out of direct view. But even walls couldn't hold back the tension now humming through the air. Gideon sat rigid, as if still expecting someone to grab him from behind. The diner's hum returned around them, plates clinking, coffee pouring, Rhett's loud voice infecting the room like a bad smell. But at their booth, time seemed to slow. Niall slid a fresh towel across the table. "Here," she said softly. "You're still soaked." Gideon hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing hers for a brief second, cold, calloused, and trembling just slightly. He dabbed his face, then his hands. When he pulled back, Niall's eyes narrowed. There were marks on his wrists, not just bruises, not like he'd fallen. Circular, deep, patterned, like pressure points from tight restraints. She didn't speak right away. She watched the way he tried to sit normally, controlling every movement. The kind of careful, practiced restraint that only came from someone used to hiding pain. Then she noticed the rest. His shirt, white, tailored, wasn't cheap. Soaked, yes, but high-end cotton, maybe custom-fitted. His shoes, though ruined by rain, had once been handcrafted leather. Italian, if she had to guess. And the watch still clinging to his wrist, half concealed by a rolled sleeve, wasn't just any watch. It was a Valcour Skymaster, limited release, known more in tech and private wealth circles than fashion mags.
It retailed at $30,000. Why would a man with a $30,000 watch be sitting abandoned at a closed-down bus stop with no wallet, no phone, and bruises like shackles around his wrists? She leaned in slightly. "Gideon, are you in trouble?" His jaw tightened. "I don't know anymore," he said after a pause. "Maybe I always was." The answer wasn't flippant. It wasn't vague. It sounded like the truth, but a truth buried under layers of pain and silence. She tried again. You said you lost your sight recently. He nodded, slowly. 4 months ago. Retinal artery occlusion. One eye completely gone. The other, maybe some light perception, but nothing useful. You were traveling with someone? His breath caught. He didn't answer. Niall's voice lowered. Were you kidnapped? At that, he finally looked toward her, his unfocused eyes tracking her voice. No, he said, but then he added, not officially. And that was when she understood. He wasn't just lost, he'd been left, intentionally. Someone had made sure he was alone, vulnerable, and unable to find his way back. The question was why. Before she could ask, movement from the counter caught her eye. Rhett was watching them, pacing slightly, nervous. His phone was in his hand, and he wasn't even pretending to hide it now. You know, Gideon said quietly, he doesn't trust you. Niall blinked. Who? Rhett? Gideon nodded toward the general noise. His voice, it's tight, controlled. He's lying about something. She studied Gideon. You can tell that? People get careless when they think you can't see. They drop their tone, forget to fake. You learn a lot listening from the outside. Niall looked back at Rhett, now clearly whispering into his phone near the coffee station. Do you think he called someone about you? Maybe, Gideon murmured. They'll be looking for me soon. Who? Gideon didn't answer. His hand was shaking again. Niall reached out and placed her fingers gently over his. He flinched, then relaxed. You're safe here, she said. They're not going to touch you, not while I'm standing. There was something in his expression then, an almost imperceptible shift. Trust, hesitant, but real. And something else, recognition. Like somewhere inside that fractured memory of his, he had known someone like her once, someone who didn't flinch. Then suddenly, a man at table 4 barked out, Hey, do you have any real servers back there or just charity workers now?
Nell ignored him. Rhett didn't. He stepped forward, louder this time. You hear that, Harper? Customers don't like being ignored while you play Florence Nightingale with some mystery man. Nell stood, calm, straight-backed. He's not a mystery. He's a man who was left outside to die. He's a distraction. You think any of these folks care? I don't care what they care about, she said sharply. The room fell silent for half a second. Rhett's eyes narrowed. You better watch your mouth. You better watch yours, said a new voice. Boone, again. This time holding a wet receipt roll like a club. Rhett raised both hands mockingly. Fine, play the hero. But when somebody important comes looking for him, don't say I didn't warn you. Nell turned back to Gideon. They'll come, she said, but so will someone who cares. Someone already did, Gideon replied, his voice almost too quiet to hear. And Nell knew, right then, that whatever had happened to this man, it wasn't random. It was planned. And she had just stepped into something far deeper than she'd ever imagined. The diner had never felt so small. Nell could feel eyes on her from every corner, some curious, some disapproving, some openly annoyed. In a town like Wilmington, people didn't need much of a reason to decide who was a problem. And a young black woman refusing to back down while defending a blind white man who couldn't explain where he came from, that was enough to make her dangerous. Gideon sat in the booth like a man made of porcelain. Still, quiet, but bracing for a crash. His fingers tapped once, twice, against the table, like counting breaths, like anchoring himself in the moment. Nell knew that rhythm. She'd done it herself more times than she could remember. She stood from the booth, straightened her shoulders, and walked calmly to the employee phone on the wall behind the kitchen. Boone met her eyes through the pass window but didn't say a word. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. Not an emergency, not yet. She pressed the second option, non-urgent police response. When the dispatcher picked up, Nell kept her voice level. Hi, I have someone at my workplace who might have been abandoned or hurt. He's blind, seems confused, and has signs of possible injury. Is he violent? The voice asked, almost too fast. No, Nell replied. He's sitting quietly, but I think he's scared.
What's your name, ma'am? Niall Harper. I work at the Pelican Crown Diner on Market Street. A pause. Then, we'll send someone when we can. Might be a while. Can you send Detective Maris Delgado? Niall asked. More silence. She helped my friend last year, she added quickly. I think she'd take this seriously. I'll put in the request. No guarantees.
The line went dead. Niall hung up slowly, jaw clenched. No guarantees. That was the story of her life. She returned to the booth and told Gideon softly, "I called someone, a detective. She helped a friend of mine once. Smart, sharp, doesn't look away." Gideon nodded. "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they landed heavy, because they were real. Boone came by with a dish towel and an empty mug, filled it with hot water, and dropped in a peppermint tea bag. He didn't speak, just gave Niall a look that said, "I've got your back." Quietly, carefully. Then he disappeared again. For a moment, things felt calm. Until Rhett returned, voice low but acidic. "That cop's not coming. Do you hear me? You think you're doing some noble thing? You're dragging this place into a mess." Niall stood her ground. "Then call the owner. Tell him I saved a man's life." Rhett sneered. "You think he'll back you over me?" She didn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't know. And that's when Gideon whispered something that sent a chill through her spine. "He sounds like the men who took me." Niall turned to him. "What?" "Same tone," Gideon said. "Same emptiness behind the authority. They act like they're protecting something, but it's not people, it's power." Niall's breath caught. She looked at Red again, really looked this time. Not just as a petty boss with a clipboard and a bad attitude, but as a man who liked having the final say. A man who didn't like being challenged. A man who might, if pushed far enough, choose his loyalty to power over doing what was right. Which meant one thing. Gideon was in more danger than she thought. Niall turned to Boone when he passed by again. "Do you still have that detective's card?" He nodded, pulled it from the plastic sleeve tucked behind the register, and slid it across the counter. "Detective Maris Delgado, Serious Crimes Unit, Wilmington PD." Niall took out her phone and dialed the number directly.
This time, she didn't wait for an operator. "Detective Delgado?" she asked when the line picked up. A sharp, steady voice replied, "Speaking. My name's Niall Harper. I think I have someone here who needs you, and I think someone's already trying to stop him from getting help." There was a pause. Then, "Where are you?" "Pelican Crown Diner, back booth." "Stay put. I'm on my way." That was all Niall needed. She put the phone down and exhaled deeply. Then she walked back to Gideon, sat across from him again, and said the words that would shift everything. "Help is coming, but so is trouble." He smiled faintly. "Then I'm glad I landed in the right place." And for the first time since he'd stepped into her car, Niall believed that maybe, just maybe, she could protect him, no matter what came next. The storm outside had eased into a soft patter, but inside the diner, the air was thick with something heavier than rain. Expectation. Gideon sat still, his face unreadable, though Niall could see the tension in his posture growing by the second. He wasn't shaking anymore. He was preparing. For what, she didn't know. But she felt it too. The shift. The sense that something was about to walk through that door and try to take everything away. She didn't have to wait long. At exactly 9:17 p.m., a black SUV pulled into the diner's lot. It moved like it belonged there. Smooth, quiet, purposeful. Niall's stomach sank. 2 men stepped out. Dark suits, pressed to perfection, even in the wet. One held a leather folder. The other opened the diner door and stepped inside like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Evening, folks," he said, flashing a smile so practiced it didn't touch his eyes. "Sorry to bother. We're looking for someone." He had a deep southern accent, but it was polished, corporate, like someone who used to bark orders on Wall Street, but now did it behind closed doors in private jets. Niall stood slowly, instinct already coiled tight in her gut. The second man entered behind him, staying close to the door, scanning the room like a security sweep. Gideon turned his head slightly, sensing them. The lead man approached the booth with that same too-casual smile. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "Mr. Vale, we've been looking all over for you." Niall blinked. Vale. That was the first time anyone had used a last name. Gideon didn't answer. The man continued. "I'm with Valion Medical Transport. We're here to take you back to your facility, sir." Facility. The word felt like poison in Niall's ears. She stepped between the man and the booth. "He's not going anywhere." The man raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "I'm the one who found him alone at a bus stop.
So unless you have proof he belongs in your care, I'm asking you to leave. Behind her, she heard Gideon whisper, "That's him." The suited man's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he recovered, flashing the ID badge clipped to his pocket. "Harlan Sutter. I'm authorized by his legal team to return him to a secure environment. He's been missing for hours and he's not well." "His name is Gideon," Niall snapped, "and he said he doesn't want to go with you." "He's blind," Harlan said, tone sharpening. "He's confused. He doesn't know what he's saying." Niall didn't back down. "He knows exactly what he's saying." Sutter's smile turned colder. "Look, Miss Harper, I appreciate your kindness, but this is way above your pay grade. You don't know what kind of trouble you're stepping into. I know what kind of people leave a blind man on a bench in a storm." That stopped him. Not long, but enough. Then Rhett, who had been watching the whole exchange with rising discomfort, finally spoke. "She's overstepping," he said, voice loud. "You want me to call the cops?" "We already did," Niall said sharply, "and the detective on the way won't be impressed by any of this." Boone stepped up beside her, arms clasped. "She's telling the truth. Delgado's coming, and I've seen this man's wrists. He wasn't in any hospital." Sutter exhaled slowly. The charm dropped like a mask peeled away. He turned his gaze to Gideon. "Gideon, come with us now and no one gets hurt. You can't protect yourself. You know that." Gideon finally spoke. Calm, cold. "I told you, if you ever called me by that name again, I'd know you were lying." Niall stiffened. That wasn't a confused man talking. That was someone who just caught his enemy bluffing. Harlan's jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake." "So are you," Gideon said, "because I've already told them everything." It was a lie. Niall knew it, but it worked. Harlan stepped back, reassessing. Then the second man moved forward. "You have no authority here," Niall said, blocking him too. He ignored her, so she did something she hadn't done since high school. She grabbed the steaming pot of coffee off the counter and raised it, just high enough to show she wasn't kidding. The man stopped. Silence filled the diner. Then, the bell over the door jingled. A woman stepped inside, badge already out. "Detective Maris Delgado," she said, voice firm. "Everyone stay where they are." She took one look at Gideon, then at Harlan, then at Niall, and without waiting she said, "Miss Harper, step aside. You've done enough. Let's finish this right." And for the first time that night, Niall allowed herself to breathe. Help had finally arrived. Detective Maris Delgado didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The kind of authority she carried didn't come from volume. It came from presence, from the calm control in her eyes, from the way everyone, even Harlan Sutter, subtly stepped back when she entered. Maris took in the scene like a general walking into a battlefield she'd already memorized. 2 suited men, a blind man at a booth, a black waitress standing protectively between them, a nervous manager sweating behind the counter, one cook, silent but tense, and a room full of people pretending they weren't watching. "Mr. Vale," Maris said, her eyes on Gideon. "Do you recognize these men?" Gideon turned his head slowly toward her voice. "One of them," he said. "Harlan Sutter. He was supposed to protect my interests." Maris's jaw tightened slightly. "And instead, he sold me out." The room went still. Harlan let out a low chuckle, stepping forward. "Detective, with all due respect, this man is not well. He's delusional. His family has been trying to get him medical help for weeks." "Is that so?" Maris raised an eyebrow. "Funny, because his company filed a missing persons report 3 hours ago, not his family, and not you." Harlan's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. "Let me see your credentials," she said, holding out her hand. Reluctantly, Harlan passed over the badge he'd flashed earlier. Maris studied it, flipped it, and then held it to the light. "You know impersonating medical personnel is a felony in North Carolina, right?" Harlan's partner shifted uneasily near the exit. "I'm going to ask you both to stay put while I verify this with headquarters." And that was when Rhett Barlow made his move. He came around the counter, puffed up with false confidence. "Detective, I think we've got a bigger issue here." Maris turned, surprised. "Oh?" "Yeah," Rhett said. "This young lady, Niall, has been interfering with law enforcement, keeping a mentally unwell man in the building, threatening customers." "Excuse me," Niall snapped, stepping forward. But Rhett didn't stop. "She even raised a pot of hot coffee at that man over there. Threatened him. On camera, I might add." Niall's mouth dropped open. "That's a lie," Boone said. But the damage was done. The truckers in the corner started murmuring. One pulled out his phone, started recording. "Is that true, miss?" Maris asked quietly. "Did you threaten someone with hot coffee?" Niall's face burned. "I didn't pour it. He was coming at Gideon and no one was stopping him. I reacted."
She assaulted him, Harlan's partner chimed in. I want her arrested. Marist sighed. Let's slow down. But Red wasn't done. This isn't the first time she's caused problems, he added, voice rising. Always acting like she's better than the job. Bringing in people off the street like she runs the place. Red, stop, Boone snapped. She thinks just because she's got a pretty face and a sob story that the rules don't apply, Red continued, spitting words like venom. I got witnesses, I got footage. You want someone to arrest? Start with her. Niall's hands curled into fists at her sides. She was shaking, not with fear, but with fury. Humiliation burned up her throat like acid, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she knew, deep down, that it might not matter. She'd seen it happen before. Innocent but loud, defiant while black. You didn't need to be guilty. You just needed someone louder and paler to say you were. Marist studied her carefully. You threatened him? I warned him. I didn't touch anyone. Camera footage? Marist asked. Red grinned. We've got it. Boone barked a laugh. That's rich. You told me last week the cameras were busted. Marist turned slowly. Red stammered. I want access to the footage, she said. Red hesitated. You're a business owner, Marist added coolly. Surely you want to clear up any misunderstandings. And just like that, his bluff crumbled. I'll check the system, he muttered, backing away. Gideon finally spoke, his voice soft but deliberate. You know the worst part, he said, facing no one and everyone. You weren't even trying to protect the truth. You were just trying to protect yourselves. The words cut deeper than any accusation. Maris looked at Harlan, then at Niall, and she made her decision. I'm not arresting anyone tonight, she said, but I am placing Mr. Vale under protective custody, and anyone attempting to remove him from this building without proper authorization will be detained. Harlan stepped forward, but Maris cut him off. Don't. The authority in her voice left no room for argument. Then she turned to Niall. You, she said, you kept him alive. You kept him safe, and you didn't back down, even when it would have been easier. Niall nodded slowly, still trembling. Maris added, just for her to hear. I've seen a lot of people fold when the pressure hits. You didn't. That matters. And in that moment, something shifted. The humiliation still stung, but it no longer had power over her, because Niall Harper had stood her ground, and the world had seen it. Detective Maris Delgado stood silently for a moment after asserting control over the room. She let the air settle and let the weight of her presence land fully. When she finally moved, it wasn't toward Harlan or Rhett, it was toward Gideon. She crouched slightly at the edge of his booth, voice low but steady. Mr. Vale, she said softly, can you confirm your full name? Niall blinked. Mr. Vale. Gideon tilted his head toward her voice. Gideon Christopher Vale, he said clearly. Born November 21st, 1981. CEO of Valion Systems. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the humming light above the counter seemed to buzz quieter. Boone let out a breath like he'd been holding it for years. Rhett's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And Harlan froze, completely. Not a flinch, not a twitch, just a cold calculation in his eyes as he processed that the lie was no longer sustainable. Maris nodded. Thank you, Mr. Vale. Then she stood, turned to face the room, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. For those of you unaware, Gideon Vale has been missing for nearly 12 hours. An emergency bulletin was issued under seal earlier today at the request of the Federal Bureau investigating Valion Systems for potential internal fraud. She paused, letting the words sink in. Niall's heart pounded. Fraud? CEO? Gideon? Maris continued. Mr. Vale experienced a sudden loss of vision approximately 4 months ago. That information was deliberately kept from the public, both to maintain company stability and for his own safety. Now her eyes found Harlan. You're listed as Valion's interim compliance officer, correct? Harlan licked his lips. Correct. You were appointed 2 months ago during Mr. Vale's medical leave. That's right. And you reported to the board directly. He hesitated. Yes. Maris nodded again, her expression unreadable. Then perhaps you can explain, she said, tone sharpening, why you were seen on security footage escorting Mr. Vale from his private residence this morning under the guise of medical transport, after overriding the security code on his gate using an emergency override without notifying his legal counsel. Harlan's face turned pale. That footage was confidential, he muttered. It was subpoenaed 3 hours ago, Maris replied, along with phone records that show you've been in contact with an offshore account manager in Belize. Now the air cracked with tension. What is this? Rhett sputtered. What the hell's going on? Maris didn't look at him. She looked at Niel. You found him at the bus stop? Niel nodded slowly. He was sitting alone, soaked, freezing. He said someone promised to come back for him. Maris's jaw tightened. They had no intention of coming back, she said. They left him there so that by morning he could be declared missing and presumed psychologically unstable, and with a little luck, dead. The words hit like a slap across the room. Niel felt the blood drain from her face. Gideon sat still, face blank, but his hands were clenched, white-knuckled. Rhett stammered, Wait, you're saying this was some corporate setup? Maris turned to him. I'm saying this man was nearly murdered by manipulation and omission, and you tried to hand him back to his attackers. But I didn't know. You didn't ask. Silence. Gideon finally spoke, his voice low but powerful. You never cared who I was. You just saw someone inconvenient, someone who didn't fit. He turned his head slightly toward Niel. She didn't see a CEO. She saw a human. Maris turned back to Harlan. I'm placing you under arrest for attempted unlawful detention, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Harlan took a step back. Don't, Maris warned, but he did. He bolted for the door. The second man moved too, but Boone was faster. With a surprising burst of strength, he blocked the path with his shoulder, arms outstretched. You aren't going anywhere, partner, he growled. Maris signaled, and within seconds, 2 patrol officers who just pulled up outside stormed in and tackled both men to the ground. Handcuffs clicked, orders were shouted, and the storm outside, now almost a whisper, seemed to pause for just a moment. When it was done, Maris looked back at Gideon, and for the first time all night, her face softened. You're safe now, she said, but we've got a lot to sort out. Then she turned to Niel. Her voice was full of something warmer than authority, respect. And you might have just saved a billion-dollar witness. Niel stood there, stunned. Her hands were still shaking, her heart was still racing, but somewhere underneath all that fear was a quiet, rising strength. Because this wasn't just about kindness anymore. This was about truth. And thanks to her, it had just been tracked into the light. The diner felt different now. Not quieter, not calmer, just rearranged. As if the world had been flipped and set down at a new angle. Still familiar, but forever changed. Gideon Vale sat where he had been all night, but now no one could look at him the same. Not the customers, not Rhett, not even Niel. They didn't just see a blind man anymore. They saw the man who owned the building, the man behind one of the most influential tech corporations in the country, the man they'd nearly left to die on a bench in the rain. Niel stood next to him, trying to process everything at once. Gideon Vale. The name was suddenly everywhere, in whispered conversations between the truckers, in Rhett's frantic mumbling as he scoured the internet on his phone, and in Boone's slow headshake as he stared at the ceiling like he was trying not to laugh out loud. You really didn't know? Boone asked her quietly. Niel shook her head. I thought he might be important, but is a billionaire CEO important? No way. Boone chuckled. Guess that's the lesson, huh? You never know who you're sitting across from, or who you're judging, or who you're underestimating. Detective Maris finished her calls near the door, speaking quietly with her team. Then she crossed the room toward Gideon again. The officers had already escorted Harlan and his partner out in handcuffs, but the aftershocks still rippled through the air. Mr. Vale, Maris said softly. EMS is on the way. They'll want to check you out, standard procedure, but I think you'll be okay for tonight. Gideon nodded. I had preferred to speak with my attorneys first, privately. You'll get that. We'll provide transport once the medical team clears you. Thank you, he said. Maris turned to leave, but paused beside Niall. You did everything right, she said, even when people tried to make you doubt yourself. Niall smiled faintly. Felt like I was walking a line the whole time. You were, Maris said, but you walked it straight. That's rare. And with that, she left, quiet and steady as she came. Niall turned back to Gideon, who sat quietly for a moment, then finally said, You stayed. She nodded. Of course. He turned his face toward her. You believed me. I saw you, she replied, long before I knew your name. That silence between them held something heavier than facts, heavier than status. It held truth. But then, across the diner, Rhett cleared his throat and stepped forward. His posture was stiff, too careful, the mask of fake confidence barely held together. Mr. Vale, he began, forcing a smile. Sir, I had no idea it was you. Please understand, I was just trying to protect the business, and... Gideon didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change expression. He simply said, Don't speak to me. Speak to her. Rhett faltered. What? Gideon turned his head toward Niall. You owe her an apology, not me. Everyone in the diner froze. Rhett's cheeks went red. He looked at the other customers, then back at Niall. He couldn't even make eye contact. Sorry, Niall. If I said anything out of line earlier, I was under pressure. You know how this job gets. No, she said flatly. You don't get to rewrite it now. She didn't yell. She didn't need to, because the truth of it was ringing out in every inch of her posture, every breath she refused to swallow. You humiliated me, she said. You called me out in front of customers. You let them mock me. You threatened my job. And you tried to hand over a blind man to people he begged me to protect him from. Rhett fumbled. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem. She stepped closer. You don't ask. You assume. You judge. And then you justify it when you're wrong.
Rhett shrank under the weight of her words. Gideon added, I'll be reviewing the lease contract for this property, but I think the Pelican Crown may have seen its last shift under your management. Rhett looked like he might faint. Boone smirked from behind the counter. Amen to that. Gideon leaned slightly toward Niall. Is there a quiet space here? She thought for a moment. Storage room. It's clean. Back of the hallway. He nodded. Would you mind guiding me there? Of course, she said. She took his arm gently, just enough pressure to help him stand, just enough space to let him lead. As they walked through the diner, the silence followed them. Not because people didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, they finally understood who the most powerful person in the room had been all along. Not the CEO, not the cops, not the manager with the clipboard. It was the waitress who didn't back down, the one who saw worth in someone everyone else overlooked and protected it, even before she knew how much it was worth. The storage room at the back of the diner wasn't glamorous. Concrete floor, wire shelves stacked with boxes of napkins, plastic-wrapped coffee filters, and old cleaning supplies. But in that moment, it felt sacred, safe, silent. Niall led Gideon in carefully, helped him to the only sturdy chair in the room, then flipped on the small wall fan to stir the thick air. He sat with quiet dignity, hands folded in his lap, head tilted just slightly, listening to everything, even the things that weren't being said. I'm sorry, Niall murmured, for what you've been through. Gideon gave a small nod. Don't be. You didn't cause it. No, she said, but I saw enough tonight to know I've stood next to men like Harlan before, and I didn't always speak up. Gideon's face softened. You did tonight. That's what matters. Before Niall could reply, the lights flickered. Once, then again, and then darkness. Total. The hum of the fridge outside stopped. The fan behind her clicked off. In the diner beyond the hallway, someone shouted, Hey, the power's out. Niall froze. Her first thought was, storm. But the rain had already died down. Her second thought, this wasn't an accident. Stay here, she whispered to Gideon. Don't move. She cracked open the storage room door and peered out into the hallway.
Emergency lights glowed weakly near the kitchen, just enough to throw long shadows across the floor. Boone? She called. A voice answered. Too far, too urgent. Yell, you okay? Yeah, where are you? By the fuse box. Something tripped, won't come back on. That's when she heard it. A click. Metal against metal. The back door opening. Her blood turned cold. Niall turned sharply, rushing back into the storage room. Gideon, we have to move. He didn't ask questions. He just stood. They're here? He asked quietly. I think so, she said, and I don't think they're waiting for a warrant. She grabbed his arm, guided him down the narrow hall, past the kitchen, and around the mop bucket still tripping on the tile. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Behind them, the creak of a footstep echoed too loud in the quiet. There was no time. The front of the diner was too exposed, too open. Think, Niall. Think. The side delivery exit. She veered left, pulled the emergency bar open, and the cool air rushed in. They spilled into the alley behind the building. A long stretch of cracked asphalt, dumpsters, and old wooden fences separating the diner from a row of darkened offices. Gideon stumbled once, but Niall caught him. Almost there, she whispered. You trust me? I already did, he replied. They cut through the alley. Behind them, the door slammed open, someone chasing, heavy boots, fast breath. A voice shouted, Stop! Niall didn't. She grabbed Gideon's hand and kept moving, out of the alley, across the next lot, past a rusted chain-link gate that screeched as she pushed it wide enough to squeeze them through. Headlights flared from the street beyond. A black car. Not police, not EMS. Another SUV. Niall ducked behind a vending machine chained to the outside wall of a shut-down laundromat. Her breath came in shallow gulps. Gideon knelt beside her, calm despite the chaos. They're trying to finish it, he said quietly. No cameras, no questions. But why now? Niall asked. They already got caught. No, he said. They got exposed. That's not the same thing. And that was when the SUV door opened. A man stepped out. Not Harlan, but dressed the same. A replacement. A cleanup. Niall's heart thudded. She looked down at Gideon, then at her phone. Dead. The service had cut the power. They were alone. Unless, she remembered, the security system Boone always complained about.
The one Rat said was too expensive to keep cloud connected. But Boone had once shown her a trick. Manual backup, stored on a USB, hidden behind the cash register. Proof. They could silence them, but only if the evidence disappeared with them. I have to go back, Niall whispered. Gideon looked toward her voice. You can't. I have to. You don't owe anyone that. Yes, I do, she said. Not to them, to me. And just like that, the choice was made. Not because she was brave, but because turning back would mean letting fear own her forever. She stood, pulled her hood tight around her face, and looked down at him one last time. Don't move. I'll be back. And then she ran, back toward the diner, back into the storm of everything. Because this wasn't just about helping a man anymore. This was about burning down the lie that said people like her should stay quiet. And for Niall Harper, there was no turning back. The courtroom smelled like old wood and nerves. Polished benches, pale walls, a ceiling fan that hummed just loud enough to make you feel like you were under a microscope. Niall Harper sat alone on the witness bench, her palms pressed flat against her skirt, her heart pounding a steady, insistent rhythm against her ribs. 3 days had passed since that night at the diner. 3 days since she ran back into the dark to retrieve the one thing that couldn't be erased, the USB footage Boone had tucked away behind the broken cash drawer. She'd found it, barely dodging the man outside, and handed it directly to Detective Delgado as backup officers swarmed the scene minutes later. The footage was gold. It showed everything. Harlan entering without cause, his partners threatening Gideon, Rats lying about the cameras, about her, about all of it. Now the case had moved fast, too fast, because the stakes were too high and the eyes of the nation were watching. The media had picked up the story. Blind billionaire CEO abandoned in bus stop corporate coup? Local waitress thwarts conspiracy? Headlines, hashtags, sound bites. But none of that mattered here, because inside this courtroom there was no clickbait, no applause, just uncomfortable silence and sideways looks. Because while the world was cheering her online, in Wilmington, they weren't sure what to make of her. A young black waitress, suddenly at the center of a high-stakes white-collar takedown.
Some people didn't know whether to be proud or suspicious, so they whispered.
She must have known who he was. She probably made it all up. Look at her, trying to be famous.
Niall heard it all, not with her ears, but in the way they glanced at her, in the way the defense attorney curled her lip when addressing her, in the way Rhett, sitting 2 rows back in a wrinkled dress shirt, refused to meet her eyes. "Miss Harper," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell the court what you witnessed the night of October 9th? She lifted her chin and began. She told them about the storm, about the man on the bench, soaked and shivering, about the way he said, "He promised someone would come." She spoke of the bruises, the blindfold, and the watch that didn't match the rest of his clothes. She recounted Rhett's threats, Harlan's lies, the moment Gideon whispered, "Do not let him touch me." And when she finished, there was no applause, no music, just silence. Then the defense stood, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a sharper voice. "Ms. Harper," she began, "you say you had no idea who Mr. Vale was when you helped him. That's right. You expect the court to believe that? You didn't recognize one of the most powerful CEOs in the country?" "I didn't," Niall replied evenly. "He wasn't wearing powder that night. He was wearing pants." A murmur in the courtroom. The defense attorney pressed on. "You claim you acted out of kindness, but is it possible you saw an opportunity?" Niall's eyes narrowed. Opportunity? Yes, for attention, for status, maybe even for money. And there it was. The question they all wanted to ask, but were too polite or too cowardly to say out loud. The unspoken accusation followed her everywhere now. That a black woman with no degree, no connections, and no pedigree couldn't possibly be the hero of this story unless she was scheming. Niall didn't flinch. She leaned forward. "No," she said. "I didn't see opportunity. I saw someone who had been discarded. Someone who reminded me of every time I'd been talked over, pushed aside, or treated like I didn't belong." She glanced toward the jury. "I helped him because I know what it feels like to be invisible." The defense attorney paused. Then, no further questions. When Niall stepped down from the bench, her legs were shaking. But she stood tall. Because in that courtroom, full of people who didn't want to believe someone like her could make a difference, she had spoken her truth, and not once did her voice crack. Later, outside the courthouse, a reporter pushed a mic toward her. "Niall, do you feel vindicated by today's testimony?" She gave a tired smile. "I didn't do it to be vindicated," she said. "I did it because someone needed help. That shouldn't be rare. That should be normal." And in that moment, the woman who once smiled through insults at a diner counter stood not as a waitress, not as a witness, but as a woman who had rewritten what courage looked like in her town. The verdict came in on a Wednesday morning, just after the courthouse clock struck 10. Guilty. On all counts. Attempted unlawful detention. Corporate fraud. Conspiracy to defraud a federal entity. Obstruction of justice. Harlan Sutter didn't flinch as the words were read. He sat in his suit, creased now, tired, with the same frozen smirk he'd worn the night Maris put him in cuffs. But for Niall Harper, sitting quietly in the second row, the moment didn't feel like triumph. It felt like release, like something inside her could finally exhale. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes, let the air settle around her, and whispered one word to herself. Good. The fallout came quickly after that. Rhett Barlow was fired within the week. Boone said the new owner came in and changed all the locks, scrapped the old cameras, and hired someone who actually paid overtime. No one saw Rhett again after he packed his belongings into a box labeled Manager of the Year. Gideon Vale remained under quiet medical care for another 2 weeks, his legal team operating like a shield wall around him while the board of Valion Systems was overhauled from the inside out. He gave no public statement, no press conferences. But he did make one call, to Niel. The first time he called, she didn't pick up. She was too overwhelmed, too unsure. The second time, she did. "Mr. Vale," she answered softly. "Gideon," he corrected gently. "Always Gideon, with you." There was a pause, and then, "I wanted to thank you, not just for saving my life, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Niel smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "You don't owe me thanks." "Maybe not," he said. "But I owe you something." That something turned out to be an offer. Not a blank check, not a miracle fix, but an opportunity. A role. Community Inclusion Consultant at Valion Systems. Remote, part-time. Focused on accessibility advocacy, employee equity, and ethical response policies for field agents. "You'd work with our inclusion board," Gideon explained. "Real decisions. Real impact." Niall hesitated. "I don't have a degree." "You have something better," he said. "You have proof." She said yes. Not because it solved everything, but because for the first time, someone was offering her a seat at the table without asking her to change who she was to sit there. She didn't leave Wilmington. She stayed in her apartment, still drove the same beat-up Nissan, still walked to the diner sometimes, not to work, but to visit Boone, who proudly told anyone who'd listen that Niall Harper saved a billionaire and humbled half this town without ever raising her voice. And she went back to school. Online, one class at a time. Public policy, social psychology, writing. She didn't post much on social media and didn't chase interviews. But word spread about the young woman who helped a blind man in a storm, about how that man turned out to be someone powerful, and how she stayed exactly the same after the world found out. At the local library, someone hung a framed photo in the reading room. It was a still image from the courtroom. Niall on the witness stand, calm, composed, speaking truth to power. Below it was a quote from her testimony. "I didn't help him because he was important. I helped him because he was human." It became something of a motto for people in that town, for people far beyond it. Because sometimes change doesn't come like a lightning bolt. Sometimes it starts with a woman refusing to walk past someone who's been discarded, refusing to look away, refusing to be quiet. And that woman wasn't anyone famous. She wasn't rich. She wasn't powerful. She was a waitress named Niall Harper. And she rewrote the story, not just for Gideon, but for herself and for anyone who'd ever been told they were too small to matter. Some people think that after the drama ends, the story does too. That once the courtroom clears, the lights dim, and the cameras stop rolling, life goes back to what it was before. But for Niall Harper and Gideon Vale, there was no going back. There was only forward, slowly, deliberately, respectfully. Gideon didn't try to buy her loyalty. He didn't show up with keys to a new house or plane tickets to Paris. He knew better. He knew Niall's kind of strength wasn't something you reward like a favor. It was something you honored. So he called sometimes, asked how her classes were going, shared updates on the accessibility programs she was helping guide from behind the scenes. And once a week, without fail, he sent her a box of fresh herbal teas, labeled in Braille, with handwritten notes from the research team. Niall, in turn, never treated him like a hero. She treated him like a man who'd been through something, who was still going through it. They spoke honestly, about fear, about doubt, about how sometimes, even after justice, healing felt slow and fragile. He admitted that some mornings he still reached for a phone that wasn't there. She admitted that some nights she still heard Rhett's voice in her head, telling her she was replaceable. They didn't fix each other. They just showed up, week after week. One Friday, Gideon invited her to lunch. His idea, his timing. A quiet cafe on the edge of town, one with soft music and real cloth napkins. She almost said no, but she didn't. He wore navy, she wore yellow. He had a new white cane. She had a notebook tucked under her arm full of article ideas about equity in customer-facing workspaces. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the trial, not about the past, about food, about how he missed the color green, about how she used to sketch dresses as a kid. And then, just before they left, Gideon said something she wouldn't forget. "I think people assume you saved me that night," he said quietly. "And in some ways, maybe you did. But Niall, I hope you know I didn't need a savior. I just needed someone to believe I was worth saving." She looked at him, heart steady. "I didn't save you, Gideon. I recognized you. And that's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be seen." He nodded slowly. "Yes, especially when we can't see ourselves." They walked out together, side by side, not touching, not needing to. And from that day forward, their connection wasn't defined by what had happened.
It was defined by what came next. Months passed. Gideon regained partial vision in one eye. Not perfect, not like before, but enough to see outlines, faces, light. He called it a miracle. Niall called it progress. And one day, standing outside a community center she helped design for workers' rights and disability access, Gideon turned to her and said, "Do you think this is what a family looks like?" Niall smiled, eyes warm. "No," she said. "I think this is what we look like." Not a savior story, not a romance built on rescue. Just two people who found each other in the middle of the storm and chose, every day after, to stay standing side by side. Some stories end with a kiss. Some end with a courtroom cheer or a spotlight moment that fades into credits. But this one ends with a quiet choice. The kind we make every single day. Niall Harper didn't become a millionaire. She didn't buy a mansion or walk away from her past like it never happened. She still paid rent, still took her little car in for oil changes, still rolled silverware when she covered extra shifts for friends. But something fundamental had changed. Her voice. She no longer lowered it when speaking truth. No longer apologized when asking hard questions. No longer let people define her worth by her job title, her skin color, or the weight of her silence. She stood taller. Not because someone gave her power, but because she realized she'd had it all along. Gideon Vale? He rebuilt his company with different eyes, literal and figurative. He made sure that no one in any branch of his organization could be ignored the way he had been, not because they were blind, or black, or soft-spoken, or unknown, but because every human being deserves to be seen. And together, without headlines or hashtags, they built something better. Not perfect, just honest. So what's the lesson? Maybe it's this. You don't have to save the world to change one. You don't need a cape to be someone's turning point. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not walk away. To look someone in the eye, especially when the world refuses to, and say, "You matter, and I'm not going anywhere." Because compassion is not weakness. Courage is not noise. And kindness? Kindness is the quiet decision to care when no one expects you to.